Thank you all for coming. I want to say a little bit about what this evening, this afternoon's lecture, where it fits within a much larger program, which I hope some of you may know about, but others of you can find out about. And really this program and all of the things that have been happening in the past few years around the study of architecture and landscapes in Canada started with a panel that Joseph Clark, whom I'll introduce in a moment, that Joseph Clark and I organized at, goodness, it must have been, Joseph, 4 years, I can't even remember, 4 years ago, who knows, like 4 years ago, pre-pandemic, on at SSAC, the Society for the Study of Architecture in Canada. And Joseph and I, who I should add, are both not from Canada, who are from the States, we wanted to organize a panel about the study of Canadian architecture and about the kind of challenges and thinking about how architecture in Canada is taught, what are some of the challenges. And once we did that, we realized that there were so many more opportunities for developing programs, particularly aimed at students here at the University of Toronto. And so Joseph and I applied for a grant, a very generous grant that was given from the Provost's office for the development of projects for teaching, really directed at undergraduates. It's the program, I don't even know what the acronym stands for, but it's the LEAF grant. So it has something to
Learning enhancement and
learning something. I can't remember, we call it the LEAF grant. But the lovely thing of that was that it gave us funding for 3 years to develop programs, courses, and opportunities for undergraduate students to study architecture in Canada. And so once we started that program, we not only then began, Joseph and I, and with the help of others, Jessica Mace, who we'll introduce in a moment, to teach courses on Canadian architecture, which had not been taught in the department for some time. But I think even more importantly, and again, this was really done through the help of our postdoctoral student, Jessica Mace, to develop opportunities for students to get really firsthand experience kind of in the field. And so what this has meant is that through the Department of Art History, although not solely for art history students, we've created opportunities for students to have internships, for instance, at SSAC, the Society for the Study of Architecture in Canada, through the Toronto Society of Architects, through the Architectural Conservancy Ontario, through the National Trust of Canada, and so on. And these have been able to happen even during the pandemic online. Now we're able to have some of them in person. But even just this last year, that there were 30 students who had placements through this program. And so that's going to be ongoing. And it really, not only I think is important that it helps students get experience in studying architecture, but it also really makes that bridge between the classroom and beyond the classroom, gives students sort of really firsthand experience in showing how the skills that happen in the classroom can be used outside, and to allow students to make a lot of professional contacts. Again, I said these internships or placements have been advertised through art history, through the art history department. That's sort of where they're run out of. But it's been, I would say half of the students have been from the Daniels, undergrads from the Daniels. So it's been really open to many different majors and students in different programs. In addition to the placements, to the courses, we also have been running, usually this happens in the winter term, in the winter semester, a series of events called Canada Conversations, which have all been online, and they've addressed different aspects. Some have been sort of more directed towards teaching, about teaching architectural history. But then we've had a number of programs on applying to graduate programs in architectural history or in heritage or conservation. We've had programs on sort of what kind of job opportunities are available for if you study architectural history, either as a major or minor or part of another program. So these again are open. Most of you, I assume, are U of T students or U of T connected, but these have been open and advertised widely to anyone who wants to attend because they've been virtual. And we've had really great participation with that and sort of just keeping the conversation going. If you have not already gone to our website, please do. It's canadaconstructed.ca. You can sign up to get newsletters. We're also on social media. And so we try to link and sort of not only say things that we're doing, but other things that might be of interest for students and others in the study of architecture in Canada. I would like to introduce my partner in all of this, Professor Joseph Clark, who is also a member of the Art History Department here at U of T. Joseph teaches primarily modern architecture, but not exclusively modern architecture. Joseph's book just came out in 2021. 21, is that right? Thank you. His book entitled Echoes, Chambers, Architecture and the Idea of Acoustic Space, which is a wonderful book and has gotten wonderful reviews. And Joseph will give a bit of an introduction to the building and to this part of the project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christy. Welcome, everybody. So tonight's lecture revolves around His Majesty's Royal Chapel of the Mohawk, located near Brantford, Ontario, on the land of the Six Nations of the Grand River. A small and outwardly unassuming structure with a remarkable history. Completed in 1785, it's one of the oldest churches in Ontario and a key site in the evolution of Crown-Indigenous relations. Its history is entangled with the complex stories of the Haudenosaunee people, the American Revolution and the Loyalist cause, the adaptation of Georgian and Gothic architecture to the Canadian environment, and the reign of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. The chapel was originally paid for by the Crown as part of the compensation to the Mohawk people for their loyalty during the American Revolution and the consequent loss of their homeland in what's now the United States. Since then, the building has symbolized an ideal of mutual respect between Canada's government, led by the monarch, and the Haudenosaunee people, an ideal that, to be sure, has not always been realized, but persists as a reciprocal commitment. It's one of only 3 structures in Canada designated a chapel royal, and this special relationship with the monarchy came to the foreground in 1984 when Queen Elizabeth visited to participate in the Six Nations Bicentennial, a notable example of the royal family's advocacy for culturally significant architecture and sustainable built communities throughout Canada and the Commonwealth. So for one component of our 2-part research initiative, a team of University of Toronto faculty and students, including Jessica Mace, who we'll introduce in a moment, a postdoctoral fellow, a PhD student at the Daniels faculty, Katie Filek, and an undergraduate student, Aline Nair, are developing a virtual exhibition to introduce the building and its history to the architectural community and to serve as a teaching resource. We visited the Mohawk Chapel over the summer, and we've conducted archival research with the support of the Haudenosaunee community that continues to worship there. You're looking at some screenshots from this project, which will officially launch in the coming months, so please stay tuned. So that's one component. The second component of the project is, of course, tonight's lecture, situating the chapel in a wider architectural and historical context by the distinguished historian Peter Coffman, an expert on among other things, on Canadian church architecture, who is studying colonial Canada as a contact zone between Indigenous and settler societies. Our work has been made possible by the Government of Canada's Platinum Jubilee Fund for Queen Elizabeth II. Of course, the project has taken on a more poignant significance with the passing of the Queen and the accession of King Charles. But above all, we especially acknowledge and thank the Six Nations people who remain the chapel's primary users and caretakers. And I'd like to single out Barry Hill, chair of the Mohawk Chapel Committee, who's been an important supporter of our research. Finally, to introduce tonight's main event, I'd like to call on Canada Constructed's own Jessica Mace, a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Art History and a scholar of concepts of modernity and heritage in the Canadian architectural context. Dr. Mace currently serves as editor-in-chief of the Journal of the Society for the Study of Architecture in Canada and secretary of the Association of Critical Heritage Studies, and she's been really pivotal to making this project happen. So, Jessica.
Thanks, Joseph. I bet you didn't know this was going to be a long string of introductions. That's actually all it's going to be today. There's not actually any content. I kid. Of course, this will be the last introduction because I'm introducing the main event, Professor Peter Coffman, and we're so excited to have him here because when we were thinking about this project and thinking about, how do we explain churches in the early Canadian context and who could we bring in to talk about this, there was no other choice for us. It had to be Peter. This is his specialty, I would say, his bread and butter, and he speaks so well on these topics. So we're so delighted, Peter, to have you here. Peter is the supervisor of Carleton University's History and Theory of Architecture program and a past president of the Society for the Study of Architecture in Canada. You've heard us mention the SSAC a few times. If anyone is interested, particularly students, reach out to either myself or to Peter. We run lots of great programs as well, in addition to the Canada Constructed program. Peter is a specialist in the architecture of the Middle Ages and its revivals, and his current research focuses on colonial architecture in Canada and kind of the ideas that Joseph was talking about, these points of tension and conflict and encounter between settlers and the Indigenous peoples of this land. Professor Coffman is the author of the book Newfoundland Gothic, as well as numerous articles in Canadian and European scholarly journals and edited volumes. If you're in one of my classes, odds are you will be assigned one of Professor Coffman's texts at one point or another. I should also mention that he is an award-winning photographer and educator, so you're in for a real treat this evening, both visually and in terms of the presentation that you're about to receive. So please join me in welcoming Professor Coffman.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jess. Is that working?
Yeah.
Sure. My voice is, I don't bellow very well. Is that better? That sounds better. I can hear it, so thank you so much, Jess, for that introduction. Thank you to Jess and Joseph and Christy and the whole Canada Constructed team for inviting me here. And maybe above all, thank you all of you for being here and being in the audience. It's great to be live in person again. And public lectures like this in person to actual human beings in the room with me used to be just a regular part of my professional rhythm. And of course, 2.5 or whatever it was years ago, that just stopped completely. And so it's been a long time. In fact, I went on one of those websites that calculates time spans and that sort of thing and plugged in the dates and discovered that since my last public lecture in person to a human audience, it has been 1,553,760 minutes. So I have to admit, I'm feeling a little rusty, so I hope you'll bear with me as I relearn how to do this sort of thing that I used to do all the time. But I'm delighted to be a small part of this really grand project that Canada Constructed is doing on the Mohawk Chapel. And I want to just clarify what my talk will be about, because full disclosure, I am not the expert in the room on the Mohawk Chapel. That would be Jess and the Canada Constructed team who are on site doing the research, digging through whatever archival materials they are, that sort of thing. So they're the experts on the chapel, and I will defer to them on that. And my job today is to look at a broader historical picture that lies behind the chapel. It's the architectural and historical contexts that I refer to in my title. Pardon me. And the chapel occupies and fits into a really fascinating textured historical landscape, and my goal today is to paint you a picture of that landscape. So you may have noticed I've chosen a biblical quote for my title. In my house there are many mansions. John 14:2 is where it comes from. And I settled on that because it's actually a very useful metaphor for the history of church architecture. Over the past 1700 years or so, church architecture has obviously taken on many, many different forms according to the beliefs, the practices, the aspirations of quite diverse cultures and periods in history and worldviews and that sort of thing. And the same is actually true of individual church buildings, especially a building like the Mohawk Chapel that's been around for more than 200 years. The buildings like this are just the momentary fringe of a really rich historical tapestry. And buildings like that represent the convergence of many different threads of historical narrative. And what I want to do today is trace some of those long historical threads and give you a sense of how they converge and intersect at the Mohawk Chapel. Now, my starting point for that will actually be this webpage, which you may or may not be familiar with. If you've studied Canadian architecture, you probably are. This is actually a webpage put together by Parks Canada, the federal department, and it's called the Register of Historic Places. And it's a really good place to go to for a very, very far from complete, but still very, very useful, useful list of some of the most historically significant buildings in Canada, and to get the sort of basic nuts and bolts information about them. And when I was preparing this and thinking, how do I want to frame this talk, I went to this website and started combing through it, and I sifted through their description of Mohawk Chapel's significance in order to try to identify the historical threads that I wanted to unravel today. And I found 4 key ones, I think, 4 things that are especially notable about the Mohawk Chapel that I want to unpack today. One of them, it is the first Protestant church in Upper Canada, which of course is now Ontario. Also, Parks Canada identified what they called its original lateral meeting house layout. I thought, that's interesting. I want to unpack that too. They refer to its mid-19th century Gothic revival features. And finally, the 4th thread I'm going to unpack is what they refer to as the depth and strength of the British-Mohawk alliance. So I want to follow these 4 threads on very winding paths through history and show how they intersect at the Mohawk Chapel, and they're all part of the building's DNA. So I'm going to start with the first one, and that is the first Protestant church in Upper Canada. So the Mohawk Chapel, yes, was the first Protestant church in Upper Canada, the first Protestant church built in what is now Ontario. And it may not be obvious on the surface if you're not very familiar with the history of church architecture, but the Protestant church building is actually quite a distinct building type in the history of church building. It has its own trajectory. And to show you this, I'm going to give you a really, really quick sort of thumbnail hitchhiker's guide to the history of church architecture. Warning, it's going to be ridiculously brief, ridiculously oversimplified, but it'll give you a rough roadmap in case that's not already in place, and hopefully it'll have a couple of nice pictures. So, Christianity, as you may know, was legalized in the 4th century by the Emperor Constantine and became the official state religion in the 5th century. And at that time, the most common, but not by any means the sole, building form for these early Christian basilicas was the basilica, like this, like Santa Sabina. Santa Sabina in Rome dates from the year 432. Now, numerous political and theological factors created a split between the Eastern and Western churches, and the East developed its own architectural idiom, which we call Byzantine. The Byzantine style remained relatively stable. Again, I'm oversimplifying grossly, but that'll do for my current purposes. Western ecclesiastical architecture, in the meantime, took quite a few twists and turns, with one style bumping other styles off the stage. So we had the style we called Romanesque, which resulted in a more complex version of the early Christian basilica in the 11th and early to mid-12th centuries. Then Romanesque gets pushed off the stage by Gothic, starting in the 1140s. It's the architecture of pointed arches, flying buttresses, rib vaults, that sort of thing. So from the later 12th to the end of the Middle Ages, we have that. And then, of course, the Renaissance kicks in Florence in the 1420s and brings classicism back, the architecture of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. That comes back to the center of the stage with the Renaissance. And then, especially in the history of church architecture in the English-speaking world, which is what we're concerned with when we're locating the Mohawk Chapel in history, there's, as I'm sure you know, a sudden interruption. Because along comes this guy, Martin Luther, who kickstarts the Protestant Reformation in Germany, and he gains a perhaps somewhat unlikely English ally in Henry VIII, who breaks ties with Rome. He remains a practicing Catholic all his life, but breaks ties with Rome and makes the English church into an autonomous entity with himself as head. Now, it's not quite a straight line from Henry VIII to England's becoming officially Protestant, but ultimately there was no stopping it at that point. Now, architecturally, the coming of Protestantism creates a bit of a challenge, because the Gothic church, as shown here, Lincoln Cathedral, descended ultimately from the early Christian basilica, was suited to and designed for a liturgy that emphasized ritual and mystery, a sort of visceral experience of the sacred. Protestant services emphasized the sermon. Congregations needed to be able to hear and see the preacher, and the sort of long, narrow shape of old that we associate with Gothic, with what you call very lively but not perfectly clear acoustics, was not ideal for a Protestant service. So the Protestant church needed to, maybe not quite reinvent, but at the very least modify the idea of what a church building needed to be or could be or should be. And here is the first example of a solution to that problem in London, England. This is the Church of St. Paul in Covent Garden, designed by Inigo Jones in 1631. And this was actually the first Protestant church built in London. So, of course, we're sort of circling around, ultimately here, the first Protestant church built in Upper Canada. This is the first Protestant church built in the imperial capital, London. Now, there's a lot I could decode about the use of style here, but I won't, because it's a bit tangential to what I want to get at here. I really want to emphasize the interior, and that is the interior. And you can see, compared to a Gothic church, it's more boxy, it's lower, the space is less compartmentalized, it's not sort of long and tunnel-like, it's more compacted. And of course, the pulpit is prominent. Everyone can hear and see the preacher properly, because that's the fundamental goal of the liturgy. And you compare that to English Gothic, and I should emphasize that I'm showing you a very extreme version of English Gothic here in Lincoln Cathedral, but it's useful to make the point economically. Compared to English Gothic, and you see how the space is evolving into something different, meant for a different kind of service, a different kind of liturgy. So St. Paul Covent Garden was the first, but not the most influential model for the Protestant church in the English-speaking world. For that, stay in London, but go here. The Church of St. Martin in the Fields, designed by James Gibbs, built between 1721 and 26. James Gibbs, really interesting article. Actually, I remember my undergraduate years here at University of Toronto, and taking a course from Michael McCarthy, if anyone remembers him. And when he gave his lecture on James Gibbs, he started off by saying, James Gibbs, like a lot of great Englishmen, was a Scotsman. So, yeah, Scottish Catholic architect who designs what becomes the paradigm, the archetype for the Anglican Protestant church building right across the English-speaking world. And what he's done here is really quite clever. He's essentially taken a Roman temple. Prototypes are ancient buildings like this one. This is the Maison Carrée in Nîmes in France, 2,000 years old. He's taken that sort of prototype and he's added to it a tower and aspire in order to conspicuously, explicitly, overtly transform this pagan temple into a Christian church. Now, just as important as this novel exterior arrangement was the interior configuration. As you can see, like St. Paul's, its proportions have a bit of a shoebox-like quality. I mean, it's a beautiful, highly ornamented, very sophisticated shoebox, but it is essentially a box. And that, to a large extent, is the point. It's designed to emphasize, of course, the sermon delivered by the preacher. The preacher stands in this commanding position on this pulpit, which is an enormous piece of furniture that rises above the ground floor of the congregation, and everybody can see and hear him clearly. Not unlike an audience gathered to listen to a public lecture. Now, the seating faces the pulpit, and there's a U-shaped gallery wrapping around three sides of the church that all face the pulpit. You can perhaps see it better in the plan here than in the photo. I've highlighted the gallery in red, and I've highlighted the pulpit in yellow. And this gallery, of course, increases the capacity and keeps the focus of the space where it's meant to be, on the preacher giving the sermon. So this became, at least in the Anglican world, the definitive example of Protestant church architecture, by far the most influential example of it. And it was copied all over the Anglo and Anglophone world. And architectural historians refer to this sort of building, with great affection, of course, as the Gibbsian preaching box. And this is an idea that has legs. And these legs march up to, among other places, Canada, or what is now Canada at the time. And in fact, there's a surviving example of this kind of building, a Gibbsian preaching box, that was actually built in Canada while James Gibbs was still alive. And that is this building, St. Paul's Church in Halifax, Nova Scotia, built in 1750. So this is just 35 years before the Mohawk Chapel. And where the Mohawk Chapel is the oldest surviving Protestant church in Ontario, this is the oldest Protestant church in Canada. And it's been somewhat altered, but this 1775 drawing gives you a pretty clear idea of what it originally looked like. It's a classically proportioned, classically detailed box. It's got the Gibbsian tower and spire that mark this classical building clearly and explicitly as a Christian church. It's not quite St. Martin in the Fields, of course. It's much smaller, it's made of wood, it's not stone. I mean, this is a colonial church, the money wasn't there, the high-level patronage wasn't there. But that it's modeled on that sort of Gibbsian prototype is very clear. This is the building as it appears today, from the side where the main entrance is, and this is pretty much, the original 1750 building is pretty much intact. Some aisles have been added off to the side, which you can sort of see here, but I tried to hide the one on the left behind a tree to give a clear sense of the original configuration. There's been a chancel added on the far side of the building that you can't see in this image. But if you ignore the aisles, then you have a pretty clear idea of what this 1750 Gibbsian preaching box in Canada looked like. And I say it's the oldest Protestant church in Canada. And it can trace its lineage very directly back to the most influential Protestant church in England, St. Martin in the Fields. And here's the inside, which shows the same affiliation with the Gibbsian tradition. We're looking roughly from the position of the pulpit, back through the church, back through the rows of pews facing the preacher, and you can see the U-shaped gallery that wraps around three sides and sort of envelops the preacher with his flock, essentially. Now, the Mohawk Chapel was built just 35 years after this church, so again, its lineage is quite direct and easy to trace. It's an easy family tree to draw, from St. Paul's in Covent Garden to the Mohawk Chapel, from the oldest Protestant church in London to the oldest Protestant church in Ontario. It's a pretty direct route, taking barely more than 150 years. But the Mohawk Chapel didn't actually follow the St. Martin's model. If the St. Martin's model is sort of the main street of 18th century Anglican church architecture, the Mohawk Chapel traveled down what you could call a bit of a Protestant side road. And that brings us to the next historically important feature of the chapel, according to Parks Canada, and that is what it calls its original lateral meeting house layout, which is different from the St. Martin's paradigm. So what is a meeting house layout? It's a layout not often found in Anglican churches of the period we're looking at. It's actually more common at this point in the much more severely Protestant and austere denominations, the dissenters and the nonconformists, as the Anglicans called them. And they're really no-frills denominations that build what you would really characterize as no-frills buildings. And they built churches in a configuration based on the premise that only the simplest of building forms is needed for worship. And that the most important thing by far in a service is to get everyone as close as possible to the preacher. So I put together this diagram to show you how it works. This is more or less the Gibbsian layout. It's not to perfect scale or anything like that. But you can see that the yellow octagon at one end is the pulpit, so that's where the preacher stands and chats, and then you've got all the pews lined up, going right down to the end of the church, facing the preacher. So, what does the meeting house do with this configuration? Basically, it rearranges the furniture. First, you move the pulpit to the long side of the church, so that even those at the far side of the building aren't actually that far away from the preacher. And of course, you just rearrange the pews so that they face the pulpit. That brings everyone nice and close to the preacher, makes it as easy as possible for everyone to hear and see the preacher and focus on the pulpit, focus on the word that's being spread from that pulpit. We do still have a superb Canadian example of this kind of building surviving here, the Covenanter Church in Grand-Pré in the Annapolis Valley in Nova Scotia. This is the oldest extant Presbyterian church in Canada, so we're getting a lot of oldists in this talk. And it's just a wee bit younger than the Mohawk Chapel. But unlike the Mohawk Chapel, it actually preserves its meeting house configuration pretty much perfectly. Now, the tower and spire you see there were actually added a bit later in 1818. So if you want to see what it originally looked like, you have to think away that tower. And if you use your imagination, work with me, I think you can probably do that. And you can see, it's so interesting. You take away that tower, and you see how austere and simple and undecorated this is. Now, there's no sense, there's no pretense here of anything like sacred space that you would have had in, say, the Roman Catholic tradition, or that you would have again later in the Anglican tradition. This is a house. It's a meeting house. It's a house for people to meet and hear the word preached and discuss it among themselves as a community. There's no sense of ritual, no sense of mystery. Inside and out, the word is everything. Now, if you go inside the door that you see there in the foreground, this is what greets you. And you can see the seats are arranged in that classic meeting house configuration. And at the far end is the pulpit, this magnificent piece of furniture that sits up high and makes certain that the preacher can see and hear everybody. Everyone can see and hear the preacher. And I don't know if you're supposed to do this, but when I was there, of course, there was no chain or rope or anything across. Jess is nodding. She's done this a few hundred times. So naturally, you got to go up into the pulpit where it's none of your business to be and look out. But the view is great from the pulpit. Here it is. It's a very commanding view. It's sort of like being the command chair of the Starship Enterprise or something like that. And of course, the preacher from here can see everybody, can make eye contact with everybody. And from here, of course, the word emanates. The word is in the foreground quite literally in this photo, the Bible, the sacred text. And it emanates from this spot and it's explained the word is king. So this spatial configuration gives really vivid architectural life to Protestant principles at their most strict and austere. And you see very clearly here how this differs in terms of its values, its approach to theology, its approach to communal worship from, say, Roman Catholicism. I'm going to show you one other example of this, because this is another gorgeous one in Nova Scotia, and I can't resist showing it to you, because it's not at all well known, and I think it should be. A variation on that meeting house theme. This is in Queens County, Nova Scotia, and it's a church of Port Medway, built in 1832. So a bit younger even than the Covenanter Church, but still nearly 200 years old. And as I say, it's a variation on the meeting house layout, but you can see, I think, how it still expresses the idea that this is a gathering place for people to hear and ponder and discuss the word. It is not a churchy church at all. move around and see it from an angle here. And again, you can get this strong sense this is a house where people meet. You pass through the small vestibule, which is on the right of the picture, and you go inside, and this is how it's arranged. Again, a bit of a variation on the theme. The seats are, the pulpit, of course, is at the far end. You can see it there. And then the seats are arranged facing each other. So you really get a strong sense here of the congregation coming to meet as a community and discuss the word. It doesn't have the same strong hierarchical sense that especially the medieval Catholic Church had of the priest being an almost, I'm hesitant to use this term, but almost quasi-divine figure, quite physically as well as spiritually separated and segregated from the rest of the congregation. So here they're gathering as a community of the faithful, not just to be led by the institution, but in a sense to walk together in their faith. And this kind of thing is the architecture, the configuration, and presumably the values of the original version of the Mohawk Chapel. And this is the tradition that the Mohawk Chapel seems to have fit in when it was first built, the severely Protestant sermon-based liturgy. But of course, Parks Canada refers to its original meeting house layout because that's not what it has anymore. It was changed in 1829. I'm not completely sure why. Maybe Jess or others in the Canada Constructed team might have some insight into that based on research they've been able to do. It was also changed in 1869. And those changes are much easier to understand. And they relate to the next feature singled out by Parks Canada that I want to focus on. That is what they call its mid-19th century Gothic revival features. So mid-19th century, 1869 to be exact, Gothic revival features added to this meeting house. So why did that happen? I'm going to keep you in suspense while I have some water. Well, in a way, it goes back to the many mansions thing in my title. In the middle of the 19th century, another generation of Anglicans came along. They had their own ideas, their own values, their own aspirations, and they grafted these ideas and values onto their church buildings. And once again, those ideas and values and aspirations have deep historical roots that I want to look at. So in the 19th century, the Gibbsian paradigm that we just looked at a few minutes ago began to fall into some disrepute. And in particular, its classical style came to be questioned. And instead, Gothic, medieval style, was championed for the first time since the Reformation. Now, it's how this came about, of course, is a really, really, really long story, but I'm going to give you the barest bones of that argument. First of all, classical was seen as pagan, whereas Gothic was seen as Christian, because Gothic, of course, was invented during the Middle Ages, a Christian era. Classicism was invented in ancient Greece and Rome, a pagan era. Gothic was seen as English. Classical was not. Classical was understood as European, specifically Italian. And of course, any Italian architecture to a 19th century Englishman has this sort of whiff of popery that they wanted to avoid at all costs. So classicism is seen with regard to some suspicion because of that. And also, and I could have spent the whole lecture on this point alone, it's so interesting, Gothic was seen as more rational and more flexible than classicism. The argument basically is that classicism is constrained by very strict rules of proportion, rules of symmetry, composition rules, that sort of thing. Gothic is not hemmed in by those rules, and it can be tall and narrow or short and fat, go on long distances. It doesn't have to worry about rules of proportion and symmetry. The form of the architecture is free to adapt to whatever the spatial needs dictate is necessary. And so it was seen as more rational. I hope that made sense, because I've just summed up, or attempted to sum up, a whole stack of 19th century books in 3 lines. So I hope that makes a certain amount of sense. Now that's not quite all there is to it, though, especially in terms of church architecture and how Gothic comes to be favored in church architecture. Because this was accompanied by a movement in the Church of England, the Anglican Church, that brought about a revival of a liturgy that emphasized the sermon less and ritual more. Essentially, a return to the medieval Catholic liturgy, but without the Pope. No Pope. And this new old liturgy was championed by a group known as the Oxford Movement. And they believed that reviving this ancient liturgy would serve people's spiritual needs better than the more severely Protestant liturgy they'd be using up to that point, and therefore they hoped, thought, believed would sort of stem some of the bleeding of congregants that they were suffering to the dissenting denominations. And they published their ideas in a series of tracts collectively known as Tracts for the Times, hence their nickname, the Tractarians. And there's a parallel architectural movement in the Church of England. And they advocated a return to medieval Gothic architectural models after the generations of classicism and Gibbs. The assumption being if we're returning to a more medieval Catholic liturgy, then it makes sense and it will be much better facilitated by a return to medieval Gothic architecture. And they were known as the Cambridge Camden Society, although they disbanded and reformed later and called themselves the Ecclesiological Society. And they published their ideas in a periodical known as the Ecclesiologist, also in various pamphlets and other books and pattern books that they produced. So this is the high versus low church split that is still present in the Anglican Church today. The Tractarians and Ecclesiologists were high church. And they became pretty dominant in the second half of the 19th century. So this combined with the earlier reasons I listed for favoring Gothic, and I think you can see how Gothic becomes the architecture of the church. So we're set for a return of Gothic. And it will return to Canada too, although of course Canada is coming here for the very first time, it's not really returning. So after generations of this being the archetype for the Anglican church building, this became the new model church. This is All Saints Market Street, designed by William Butterfield, built between 1850 and 59. And of course, it's everything St. Martin's was not. It's Gothic, it's mysterious, it's mystical, it's essentially dazzling. And this is a huge transformation from Gibbs as exemplar to Butterfield as exemplar. And this was felt in Canada and ultimately felt at the Mohawk Chapel. So when, how did all this filter across the ocean and into Canada? Well, even before Tractarian and ecclesiological ideas made their way to Canada, Gothic, in a tentative form, had started to appear. The building I'm showing you here is possibly the earliest, at least I would say it's the earliest verifiable example of a building in Canada that has unequivocally Gothic features. This is Christ Church in Carsdale, Nova Scotia, in the Annapolis Valley, built around 1791. Now, the only Gothic features here, what I point out here with the arrows, are the windows on the side, which are pointed windows. And obviously, those windows don't make this into what you'd consider a fully blown Gothic church, the way the ecclesiologists would have understood it. But then, of course, this is actually 50 years before the founding of the Ecclesiological Society. So, it's a pretty early step. So what we have here, I think, is a function of a very slowly growing change in taste, which maybe in 1791 didn't quite favor Gothic yet, but at least found it a bit more interesting than the previous generation would have found it. So the arrival of the Gothic style in Canada might actually have begun right here in Carsdale. But the Cambridge Camden Society really kick-started the style a few years later, and buildings that would have looked perfectly at home in medieval England suddenly started miraculously appearing in Canada, especially at first in Atlantic Canada again. And this will manifest itself in some really, really fine, newly built churches in the Gothic style. Here's one of the first examples, St. Anne's Chapel, Fredericton, New Brunswick. The architect was Frank Wills. His patron was the Bishop of New Brunswick, John Medley, and as you can see, it was begun in 1846. And this is a meticulous interpretation of very precise English medieval prototypes like this one, 14th century parish church of St. Michael in Long Stanton in England. And it essentially transplants its medieval prototype smack in the middle of Victorian Canada. And at the same time this was being built, the same architect working for the same patron was working on that bishop's cathedral. Christ Church Cathedral in Fredericton, again, Frank Wills, began in 1845. And this is, again, closely based on two precise medieval prototypes. St. Mary in Snettisham, which you see on the right, and also Silby Abbey, which you see on the left, which is where they copied that incredibly elaborate tracery of the east window. Now, of course, buildings like this were the result of having a bishop who had strong Tractarian and ecclesiological leanings. John Medley had all the pull and the resources needed to make these extraordinary buildings a reality in these somewhat unlikely places. And the same is true of the other, probably most high-profile contemporary manifestation of this kind of Gothic in Canada, which is this building, the Anglican Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in St. John's, Newfoundland. The bishop here was, again, a Tractarian, very interested in ecclesiology, was Bishop Edward Field. The architect he chose was Sir George Gilbert Scott, whom some of you may have heard of, the most prolific, most famous, most successful Victorian architect and a real champion of the Gothic revival. One work of Scott's you might be familiar with is the Albert Memorial in London. He's in fact so prestigious was his work, so distinguished was his career, that when he died, he was actually buried in the nave of Westminster Abbey. So this cathedral is sort of a blend of Lincoln and York Minster and a few other 13th century English influences. And it epitomizes this trend that swept Anglican church building in the second half of the 19th century. It was obviously never going to look like this in the Mohawk Chapel. In the Mohawk Chapel, of course, is a small parish church. It's not a cathedral. There wasn't the episcopal patronage or budget for a complete rebuild in stone like this. And of course, Gothic had to be retrofit onto the original building. So how are we going to do that? The building we have now has, of course, already had that retrofit, so we have to imagine its original appearance. And I'm going to surmise that the original windows on the side of the church probably looked more or less like this. And this would be very much in keeping with the meeting house tradition that we saw, for example, at Port Medway and Grand-Pré. And if you want to retrofit Gothic onto a building like this that is emphatically not Gothic in any respect, probably the lowest hanging fruit is to change the windows into this, pointed arch Gothic windows. And you add those windows to a building like this, and it immediately separates you, puts some distance between the building and its current users and the meeting house tradition, and suggests something much more medieval in inspiration. The pointed arch, of course, is universally recognized as one of the most distinctive and definitive hallmarks of the Gothic style. So it's a quick, shorthand way of announcing this new affiliation to Gothic with everything that implies in the later 19th century. I'm going to go out on a bit more of a limb and speculate. Again, the Canada Constructed team may be able to correct me on this, but I wouldn't rule out, although I don't know for a fact, that maybe when the tower and spire were added. Because another way to Gothicize a non-Gothic building, as we saw at Grand-Pré, is to add some sort of strong vertical element, especially something like a spire. Now, there was a tower and spire at Grand-Pré, but as we know, it wasn't an original part of the original building. There's nothing like that at Port Medway. So adding something like this to what would otherwise be a very austere meeting house type of building would suggest this new set of architectural and perhaps liturgical priorities. So maybe the tower and spire were added then, although as also we saw at Grand-Pré, one was added there relatively early in its life without in any way pulling it away from its meeting house traditions. And of course, that's it. The tower and spire were, as we saw, also a typical feature of the Gibbsian preaching box. So maybe they were present from the beginning, and it actually provides some evidence that the influence of Gibbs and that whole tradition of architecture did actually have some influence on this building after all. But I'm just, until proven otherwise by Jess, I'll cling on to the idea that maybe the spire wasn't original, or even if the spire was original, then maybe the pinnacles you see here were added as part of the Gothicization project. Because again, adding that element of verticality, which is not really what you're after in a meeting house, would be another simple way to make the building look more Gothic. It was also somewhat Gothicized on the inside, especially with the prominent Gothic arch that you have at the east end. And of course, in terms of its proportions and with features like the low enclosed ceiling, this remains inside more like a Gibbsian preaching box than an actual Gothic church. but the pointed arches and pinnacles do indicate to some degree at least a turn away from the severe Protestantism of the meeting house. And you can see how it's moving away from the austere starkness of the meeting house into something that appeals to the senses, not just to the mind. It'd be fascinating, although I don't know if it's possible, to try to chart the evolution of the liturgy at the Mohawk Chapel and see how and if it aligns with these architectural changes. Again, I'll leave that to Canada to construct. Now, I've left the most interesting and by far the most complicated feature to last. According to Parks Canada, a key part of the heritage value of the Mohawk Chapel, quote, resides in the witness it bears to the depth and strength of the British Mohawk alliance. Now, there's certainly no question that that's true, but I want to dig a bit deeper and ask what this building and other related analogous buildings, roughly contemporary in Canada, tell us about the relationship between settler and Indigenous cultures, especially with respect to the Church's relationship to Indigenous cultures. So if these buildings bear witness, let's look at what sort of testimony they give us. So without a doubt, the Mohawk Chapel obviously manifests a strong relationship between the Mohawk and the British. It was built by the British Crown for the use of the Mohawk people. The Anglican Church does have other examples of churches built, at least in part, specifically for Indigenous use that are not too much later than the Mohawk Chapel. So I want to look at a couple of those and see what sort of pattern starts to emerge, if anything. So here's an example. This is the Church of St. James in Battle Harbour, Labrador. It was consecrated in 1857 and probably finished just a short time before that. The architect was actually William Gray, who was the diocesan architect to Bishop Edward Field. And this was built in a pretty remote place on a little island off the coast of Labrador, in part to serve what they hoped would be a growing number of Anglican converts among the local Inuit population. If we go to Western Canada, go to Stanley Mission in Saskatchewan, church built around the same time, and again in part to serve a Cree community. Now, I haven't been to Stanley Mission, so my thanks to Malcolm Thurlby for this photograph. It's again quite a remote place. And then closer to home, Eastern Ontario, Church of St. Thomas in Moose Factory, again built in part for the Cree in Northern Ontario, begun in 1864. Actually, this image I need to thank some of my Carleton colleagues. The Carleton Immersive Media Studio in the School of Architecture at Carleton is in the middle of a very interesting longish term project gathering stories and oral history from Moose Factory, and this image comes from one of their trips there. So these are all of examples of what we can call contact architecture, which is a term I'm borrowing and adapting somewhat from cultural history. What I mean by that is they're built to be a place of contact between two cultures, settler and Indigenous. And that kind of encounter, settler, Indigenous, conqueror, conquered, of course that kind of encounter occurs all the time throughout history. And such contact can and often has resulted in a hybrid architecture that combines elements of both cultures. I'll reach way back into medieval history just for three simple examples. Examples from the Middle Ages where this sort of contact has happened. When there's England on the left, top right is Sicily, bottom right is Spain. These are all hybrid architectures. This is the kind of explicit, unmistakable hybridity that can occur in architecture that is created when cultures intermingle, even if they intermingle somewhat violently through conquest or something like that. And this kind of explicit hybridity can occur in the context of 19th century Anglican colonial architecture as well. And probably the most remarkable example is something I'm just stealing here from the work of Richard Sunt, a scholar at the University of Oregon. And he's done a lot of work on Anglican churches, 19th century Anglican churches built by and for the Maori Indigenous people in New Zealand. This is the cover of the book he wrote on that topic. These buildings are fascinating. They're recognizable churches to Western eyes, but they incorporate substantial and obvious amounts of Maori building tradition, building expertise, Maori ornament. So this is unmistakably contact architecture. It's truly hybrid because culturally it is so unmistakably co-authored architecture, Maori and English, Maori and Anglican. But its Canadian equivalents that are pretty exactly contemporary with this tend not to be. Now, as examples of contact architecture, you might expect these Canadian churches to be cultural hybrids as well, but they're pretty conspicuously single-authored. They grow from English traditions. The Protestant church, the Meeting House, the Gothic Revival, all the stories I've told so far are stories coming out of England. So they grow out of English traditions, and they utilize English design and building principles. And I think that fact that historically our contact architecture is quite one-sided reveals something fundamental about the settler-indigenous relationship, something that still burdens us. I think that 19th century settlers and missionaries lacked the intellectual apparatus, lacked the mental perspective necessary to even realize that what they were dealing with when they came to this part of the world were fully formed cultures. They tended to see indigenous communities as empty vessels, culturally and spiritually. And they thought that their job was to fill up these empty vessels. And I think that is at least part of what this architecture is showing us. But on the other hand, these buildings consist of many mansions. And the Mohawk Chapel itself also shows us progress and shows us the possibility of evolution in this relationship. These windows, I show you 3 of 8 here, tell the story of the interaction of the Six Nations with the British. So it adds an absolutely crucial piece to the puzzle. Here's the Indigenous narrative, so often ignored when we talk about our history, including our history of interactions with Indigenous peoples. So it is present there now, but these were built between 1959 and 62. The church had already been there for about 175 years by the time this was added. And that should give us pause. I think our architecture here is sending us a message about our shortcomings, to be blunt. Now, I don't want to end on a downer like that, so by way of an epilogue, I want to look at one more building. It's a much newer building, it's not a church, and it's nowhere near Ontario, but it's a building which sends us perhaps a more encouraging message about the dynamic we need to and can forge between settler and Indigenous cultures and our understanding of our shared collective history, and maybe suggests that we've made some progress. So we're going to go up the Labrador coast to the area known as Nunatsiavut, to the town of Hopedale, which I highlight here on the map. And this is the Nunatsiavut Assembly Building, built in 2012 by a collective known as the Inuit Consultants Limited. And here again, it is contact architecture, government-sponsored project for a largely Inuit community that has been integrated with settlers for nearly 300 years. And in purely architectural terms, this building, unlike the historic churches in Canada that we've been looking at, does have multiple cultural parents. Let's take a closer look. This is the side facing the water, so the front of the building. And this wing of the building is essentially a domical, or more precisely semi-domical building with a tunnel-like entrance area. I'm describing this in sort of Western architectural terms, but it might look familiar to you because it is, of course, quite deliberately based on the igloo, the temporary snow shelter that the Inuit have been building for centuries, maybe millennia, that they used to take cover from bad weather. So this is in part based on the igloo, but there are other things going on here too, because the building behind that igloo section, the building, the windows, they're a reference to the Moravian European Protestant church mission that is literally just up the road in Hopedale. Moravian missionaries arrived in this part of the world in 1771 and have been ever since a really important cultural force in Nunatsiavut. And the Inuit, of course, remained Inuit, but many also became and remain Moravians, Moravian Christians. And these two cultures coexisted and intermingled and created a culture that was distinct from either their Inuit or Moravian predecessors, although clearly related to both. These Moravian mission buildings in Hopedale are now a heritage site run by Parks Canada, so they're still quite intact. And if you look at the windows of the building on the left, you can see that they're echoed in the Assembly building, as is the cupola on top of that building, which is reinvented at the Assembly building as an open work canopy over an inukshuk. So this is truly hybrid architecture. This is a conversation between two cultures, not a monologue. And this perhaps embodies the kind of relationship we aspire to have with Indigenous culture and history. And the 18th and 19th century churches that perhaps embodied the kind of relationship they had at that time. Of course, we sometimes look to history in search of our own values. We look to history sometimes to build bridges between the past and present. But I think we're recognizing more and more that it's important also to look to history as a foil, as a lesson learned in a sense, rather than as a vindication of our own worldview and our own positionality in the world. So let's summarize how the story of this building has shifted and evolved, the many mansions of the Mohawk Chapel. It was an expression of English Protestant ideals and practices, clearly and overtly distinct from Roman Catholic. It embodied the most austere simplicity of a particular phase of English Protestantism, the meeting house. It joins in a spiritual rejuvenation of sorts of the church in the mid-19th century and looks to more ancient, more mystical practices. And it's a place of overlap between settler and Indigenous historical narratives and charts our very imperfect history of acknowledging this partnership. It's just one building, but it's many stories, many meanings. As I said, any building that's existed for over 200 years has a lot of different ideas, different values, different stories imprinted on it. And that's why when we walk into a historic space, it's, for me at least, it's like walking into the minds of the people who made it. And that's why a building like the Mohawk Chapel has so much to give us, has so much value, has so many stories to tell. And in my experience, nothing tells those stories in all their very, very complex richness more vividly and more viscerally than the buildings that are quite literally made of them. Thank you.